Hello, everyone. Good to be with you tonight. I am excited to get to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Conrath. So she has her PhD in social psychology, and she's an associate professor of philanthropic studies at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy. She is also at Notre Dame University, and she is the director of the interdisciplinary program on empathy and altruism research, a research lab that primarily focuses on motivations, traits, and behaviors relevant to philanthropic giving, volunteering, and other pro-social behaviors. So her work has been published in top scientific journals, and she's been featured in several media outlets, including the New York Times, Huffington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, and NPR Radio. I personally am fortunate to have gotten to know Sarah over the last year. I'd reached out to her as I'd begun my work here with the Kindness Enterprise, and was diving into empathy and compassion, of which Sarah is an expert in the field. And so she has been a wealth of knowledge and resources. So Sarah is a brilliant mind. She is someone who strives to practice what she preaches, and she's going to shoot you straight when it comes to the science. So with that, let's get to it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Conrath.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight. I'm very excited to share with you the work I've been doing on burnout, and I know that this is a tough year, and a lot of us are feeling it already, actually, but what I'm going to talk about today is that this has actually been a trend that has been happening even before this difficult year, and hopefully we can learn what burnout is and also what we can do to reduce burnout. So the first question is, what is burnout? I think we all kind of subjectively know, we can feel it, but workplace burnout is actually a technical diagnosis now that's been recently recognized by the World Health Organization International Classifications of Diseases, and it has three key symptoms. One is emotional exhaustion, two is cynicism or low trust, and three is low feelings of accomplishment or low efficacy. Burnout is important because not only does it affect our own well-being and health, but it affects our ability to care for others and also to do the kind of work that we want to do, the quality and the quantity of work we want to do. So in my forthcoming book, I'm going to specifically be looking at generational changes. I'm going to be answering the question of what's happening to burnout in young Americans in recent years compared to the past. I'm interested in something broader than workplace burnout, something that I call personal burnout. It's the feeling of exhaustion and unease that affects all aspects of everyday life. I believe that American young people are becoming burned out even before they hit the workplace. And I'll next review the three key symptoms of burnout and show you what's happening in them over time in young Americans. So the first symptom is emotional exhaustion. First, just generally, I don't think burnout is limited to young people only. So here's an example of changes over time in Google search trends for words related to the first symptom of burnout, such as tired, exhausted, no energy. And as you can see, they have been increasing over the past 16 years since Google has been collecting data. And of course, as you can see, that we are feeling beyond tired this year. Exhausted and no energy is at least what in searches, that's what people are searching. But I am interested in zeroing in on young people specifically and directly asking them, when we zero in on them and we directly ask how overwhelmed they are, we can see here in this graph a large increase since the 1980s in the percentage of first-year American college students who say that they're overwhelmed by all they have to do. This means that more than double the percent of today's young people are reporting feeling overwhelmed compared to the same age young people in 1984. Even worse, lots of other research has found increases in mental health symptoms like depression and anxiety in American college students and high school students across a similar time. So this shows that this first symptom of burnout, emotional exhaustion, has been increasing in young people over time. The next symptom is cynicism or low trust. Having trust means that you believe that other people are good and they have your best interests at heart. And as you can see from this chart, using data from the National General Social Survey, Young adults have been declining in trust over time since the 1970s. This graph is for young adults ages 18 to 25. And research finds that it's not just trust in other people, as is shown in this graph, but young adults are also less likely to trust institutions like banks, the government, the media, and the court system. Lots of other research shows that supports these results, including in high school students and in college students. So now we're moving into the third symptom of burnout, low feelings of accomplishment or low self-efficacy. So this one is a puzzling one for me because compared to young people in the past, there's evidence that today's young people, they actually have higher IQ scores. They have higher standardized test scores than young people in the past. And I know this one's hard to believe, but there is data showing that young people today have more self-control than young people in the past. They're more willing to wait to delay their gratification. So it makes sense that these smart kids with high self-control would have high expectations for what their lives might look like. These expectations are becoming increasingly unrealistic over time, though. For example, in 1976, as you can see in this chart, 27% of high school seniors expected to earn a graduate degree, but in reality, only about 6% of the population did. That was already a pretty big gap. But by 2017, 58% of high school students expected they'd earn a grad degree when only 13% of the population earned one. So the gap between expectations and reality more than doubled from a 21% gap in 1976 to a 45% gap in 2017. Overall, I think that what's been happening is that young people are facing an increasing gap between what they expect from life or what they want and what they're actually doing or getting from life. And considering these increasing gaps, perhaps it isn't surprising that high school seniors in the US have been declining in feelings of self-efficacy over time. So self-efficacy is just a fancy word for feeling that you can do something, like that you can reach your goals. And young Americans are less likely to believe that over time. So they're less likely to agree, for example, that when I make plans, I'm almost certain that I can make them work. So again, these are really bright people with high expectations, but they're not feeling like they can actually get what they want in life. So I'll next discuss why I think burnout has increased over time, and especially in young Americans. So in order to understand that, we first need to understand what I call the burnout equation or recipe for burnout. Research on workplace burnout says that it's more likely when the demands and expectations put on individuals are greater than the resources that they have to deal with them. Of course, it's important to note that we shouldn't blame the individual. We should look to the environment around them, the workplaces and the culture that pushes people toward overproductivity at the expense of their own health and well-being. So a child grows up in many different environments. And here I'll focus on changes over time in the demands and expectations in the home and in the school context. Both of these can help to explain why burnout is increasing in young people. Let's start with the home. Over the past several years, there have been major increases in parenting demands, which ultimately puts pressure on our children. There's been an increase over time, for example, in helicopter parenting, which pushes children toward high achievement and hard work, often at the expense of caring for themselves and others. Despite having fewer children, there's been an increase over time since the 70s in the number of hours that parents are spending with children, especially in activities that are developmental or structured, like reading or doing homework together, compared to less structured activities like playing. And there, as you see in this graph, there are even bigger increases for those who have college degrees. So people with parents with mothers, particularly, this one is graph is showing on mothers. The same trends are found in fathers as well. And it might seem great. You might say, well, isn't it good that parents are spending more time with their kids? But I think it's important to ask what's motivating these changes. And if we're doing these structured activities, these higher pressured structured activities, what other activities are we not doing as a result? What do we have less time for? And finally, we should ask, what are the implications for helicopter parenting, both for the children and for the parents themselves? Is this good for people's well-being? Since the 1980s, there has also been an increase in the percentage of parents who say that the number one trait that they value in a child is hard work. Perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised because other research finds the percent of Americans who work more than 50 hours per week is dramatically rising over time. We parent our values. There have also been increases in the demands and the expectations that children and young adults face in the school setting, again, without a similar increase in resources. This graph shows the number of hours that American children have spent per week in school since the 1980s. Overall, you can see there's been an increase, and that increase is about 1.5 hours per week. That might not seem like much, but this adds up to about 2.5 weeks more of full-time instruction over one academic year. So you have to always think, what is that cutting out in children's personal lives? At the same time, there's a higher percentage of that time that's now devoted to teaching, actual instruction, which has ended up cutting out more of recess and lunchtime. Now, getting to older kids, college students, young adults is a better way to put it, college students, you can see that there's been a rise in competitiveness of getting into college. Now, I'm looking at this in this graph here, the number of the percentage of college freshmen who apply to 6 or more schools. You can see now that's kind of getting to be almost the norm. About 40% of young adults are doing that, but even up to 1980, less than 5% were applying to more schools. And to me, that's just one indicator of college competitiveness, and there are many others. But it's also in a context of dramatically increasing college tuition. So you can see that in this graph, there's been a major increase in the average cost of college tuition, controlling for the year of in 2017, 2018 dollars. And what this ends up doing is saddling young people with debt. And these patterns tend to be more extreme for private universities. So the even broader context that affects our lives is the economic one. We might not see it or touch it or walk in its halls, but it's in the background and it's affecting our feelings and our decisions. We've already seen a hint of this in the rising competitiveness of college and the cost of tuition, but these are just symptoms of the broader trends of economic inequality that are putting extra pressure on most Americans over time. Increased parenting, school, and work demands are all stemming from dramatically increasing inequality and economic demands that we face when we have basically less resources and not enough safety nets to buffer us from inequality. So economic inequality, well, it simply means, as you see in this graph, well, the rich are getting richer and the rest of us, most of us, are struggling to work hard to maintain our previous standard of living, and that's not, for many of us, that's not possible anymore. Workers are actually becoming more productive over time, as you can see in this graph, but that is not paying off with more resources. But let's break it down. So on the left side of this graph, you can see that up till 1979, when workers worked harder, this actually, and increased profits for the company, this actually also ended up with a higher paycheck for themselves. But after 1979, this gap between productivity and compensation gets bigger. Actually, productivity increases 70%, but workers' wages only increased about 12% on average. So where do all the extra profits go? Well, as you can see from this graph, they seem to go into CEOs' bank accounts. They seem to be profiting from our culture of burnout. And as they now make an average of, in recent years, about 276 or more times the average worker wages. And as you can see in the 80s seemed like an opulent time, but at that point, CEOs were making about 33 times the average worker wages. So this is what economic inequality looks like. The top 1% are getting richer, while the rest of us are struggling to stay on the hamster wheel of overwork. And we can see this happening even during the pandemic, with the people who are the richest in the world, the billionaires, profiting from the suffering that many of the rest of us are facing. So why do I think economic inequality has helped to create this culture of burnout? Well, my research has found that the changes over time in economic inequality are highly overlapped with changes in the burnout symptoms. I'll spare you the technical details because, well, I don't want to bore you or like burn you out tonight when you're here like after work for a fun talk. But I don't think it's a coincidence that at the same time that there's a smaller slice of the pie for most Americans, we feel increased pressures to push our children toward a narrow definition of achievement and success. Overall, trends in parenting, school, and work suggest less leisure time for children to spend time doing things that research has found actually helps buffer us from burnout, such as play, exercise, time in nature, time socializing, time reading or engaging with the arts, and of course, sleep. My book gets into more detail about changes in each of these and how they're linked to burnout symptoms. So the recipe for burnout, thankfully, it's actually also a solution. Now let's see if this animation works. But what we're trying to do, what you need to do if you want to reduce burnout is you need to increase the resources and decrease the demands and expectations. And there's so many different ways to do that. So we're going to start with discussing some individual things we can do, and then we'll move broader to our society. So here are some ideas about what we can do in our personal lives if we want to prevent and alleviate burnout. The first thing that I would recommend is notice the sources of burnout in your own life by noticing imbalances in your own work, leisure, and sleep cycle. And like I've given you this idealized pie chart. Like how many of us actually fit this, right? Do we all get 8 hours of sleep every night? Do we have 8 hours for just leisure? These are idealized. And by leisure, I just mean like not paid time, not paid work time. But you can see that you might notice just by looking at this pie, there might be something that isn't balanced. Leisure and sleep can actually help to recharge us, just like our phones need to be plugged in, so do we. We need to relax too. And oftentimes these are the first to go when our work is more demanding. Full-time workers, especially professionals, have been increasing in the number of hours worked over time, as I've already mentioned. And this is the graph that shows you that the percentage of full-time workers who work an unhealthy 50 hours or more per week has increased since the 70s. And I think the numbers might be actually higher when we really consider that the lines between like work and home and not work are all getting blurry. Like, is it work if you go out for a bike ride and then stop on a bench and check your email, your work email? You know, I don't know that anyone's counting that on a survey, but it definitely gets in the way of like relaxing and enjoying your time off. So research finds that actually for every hour that we work, over 40 hours, we have an increased risk of mental and physical health problems. So here's an example. A meta-analysis that included over 600,000 previously healthy adults found that those who worked between 41 to 48 hours a week had a 10% increase of having a stroke. This moved to 27% increased risk of a stroke if people worked between 49 and 54 hours a week, and a 33% increase when they worked over 55 hours per week. Not surprisingly then, people who work long hours also have an increased risk of early dying, especially from cardiovascular related causes. So unless you want to rest in peace a bit early, it probably makes sense to learn to rest peacefully now while you're still alive. And all of us could practice within our culture of overwork. So there are many different things we can do to help reduce our own burnout. And I've listed some here. Obviously, different people respond differently to what energizes them and what depletes them. Part of it is just getting to know yourself. But I can say that there are some powerful ones that work for most of us. And one of them is sleep, making sure that you get all the sleep that you need. Physical activity is really helpful too. And combining it, doing it in nature or with a friend, anything you can do to get a number of different positive things together would be really helpful. So I just encourage you to reflect on how you can take care of yourself. And although there are small things that we can do as individuals though, giving burned out people wellness tips doesn't make this problem go away. The causes of burnout are more structural. They actually come from the broader context of our schools, workplaces, and cultures. And the solutions also need to come from these spaces. So let's think about that burnout equation, right? So we need to think about how do we reduce demands and expectations, for example, in the workplace, or how do we increase resources? So to reduce demands and expectations, maybe workplaces can encourage some email or work blackout times, such as evenings and weekends, depending on the nature of your job, or encourage workers to take their vacations and step away completely from work. During this major crisis, workplaces that are flexible with workers, and especially those who are homeschooling, are really going to help. And then in terms of increasing resources, obviously economic resources matter. So fair pay and benefits, including mental and physical wellness support are good. And also that social piece is really important. So having a caring and supportive and egalitarian environment can be really helpful to make people get less depleted from the workplace. So there are many different ideas, and I challenge you in your own lives, in your own workplaces, to think about what you can do to reduce the kind of more structural causes of burnout in the workplace. Still, workplaces themselves are still operating within a broader culture. So if economic inequality is ultimately driving the increasing burnout in younger Americans, then policies to help alleviate economic inequality are going to be the most helpful ultimately to reduce our culture of burnout. So thanks very much. That's all I have to say. I know it's a lot, but I hope we can have a productive conversation.
Thanks, Sarah. Wow. So there is so much just relevance and application, I think, to everything that you shared. It kind of piqued my interest when we talked about learning, leisure time and really learning what energizes us and what depletes us. And so I think that takes, to some degree, a level of awareness, and I think also challenging even some cultural norms around that. So, it's like they think, oh, I'm taking a break and I'm just going to go on Facebook for, 15 minutes or an hour. But really that's not relaxing. That's energizing, or that's stimulating. There's emotional triggers. You're seeing things going on in the world. There's headlines and whatnot. And so I guess I think it's really interesting, the piece of having to, you really have to take the time to learn not only what works for yourself, but is that truly a regenerative practice, as opposed to something that's going to further drain us. And along with that, really a lot of decision making comes into that. We're kind of in this attention economy. And so there's a lot of things competing for our resources, and our attention is a really prized resource. And so love the idea also of kind of, striving for more balance. You showed kind of the 8-8-8 ratio.
Right.
And I like the idea of pushing people to, to think about that. And something that we recommend a lot is, rather than thinking just about what it is, the kind of the tasks, or specifically in those broad categories, but really what is it from a brain power standpoint. So this may be something that, what are the things that really require deeper level thinking, and how to kind of structure your day in that way to be sort of conserving that cognitive energy. But okay, and so on the topic of, I'm bouncing back now to the idea of social media being relaxing or not, and brings up this topic of technology use within leisure time. And so I know you've done a lot of work relating to technology, and would love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we do think that technology could burn us out, but I actually think, it's not necessary. It's not necessarily technology for work maybe, because there's been this increased expectation that we're glued to our screens, we're available by email nonstop, and we really, this feeling that we have to multitask too using technology, when as a brain scientist, we're not really good at that in general, right? So I think definitely in the workplace, and the way technology is being used in the workplace, it's definitely part of the problem. Now, as for leisure time, I don't think it's necessarily social media itself, but it might be our choices, what we're doing with it. I think it can be a really positive way to connect. And I also think, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and right now, some of us are mainly socializing like online.
Right.
And of course, it's not the same as face to face. It doesn't feel as good, but we're still able to connect with people. So I would just encourage people to use technology in ways that actually fulfills you and makes you feel good. And if you find that it's not doing that, then drop it.
Mhm.
But like for me, like talking to you, Julie, when we hang out, that feels good. And that's
Right.
kind of the use of technology that I want to continue.
Love that. Love that. Love the perspective too that it's not all technology is good, not all technology is bad. It really just comes down to individual use case and just again being mindful of how it's affecting you. So I love that. I loved the idea of you mentioned just kind of things we can do as individuals, and maybe when your structured environment, your workplace, certain scenarios may be out of your control, but there are still things very much within our control. And so would love to hear, I guess, more examples of ways that you personally do this in your life, and love how you really walk the walk on a lot of these things.
I do try because I do feel like, of course, like in many careers, there's this increasing pressure for productivity more than, say, 20 years ago when you think what's expected from scientists now compared to the past. So I'm aware that like there's no end to my work really. And so I've actually worked really hard in this book. Writing this book actually kind of was like good for me in a sort of therapy way because it made me realize, like, pay attention to what I'm doing and the work, how much work time I'm spending work, and what I'm missing out on as a result. So
Mm.
what I do for my own life, at least, is like I pay attention to what I'm doing, the work I'm doing, and I really try to unplug completely. Like I like go on walks. Like I'm outside a lot. I want to hang out with people, socially distance, safe, all that. But just trying to really practice what I'm learning from the book and from researching the book. But then I also try, like, of course, I mentor students and I teach students, and I try to be aware that my role, like, is there to be supportive, and I don't want to be the one who pushes a student over the edge so that they're in burnout. So I want to actually, I really try hard to um, not only model that life, but be flexible with students, encourage people to take time off, be understanding, of course, when things are going slower than they should, and just in general, just realize that there are more important things in life than work and than productivity. And those are things that my students and I share, actually, like
Mm.
values and like relationships are way more important to me, at least. And I think that showing my students that, hopefully they know that I care about them regardless of whether they publish that paper.
Mm. Love those examples. Um, so speaking of students, and I know that your main interest is kind of this young adult college, student population. There's a lot going out there. I just want to think about, I guess, when we think about burnout and just the information overload that's going on, or we've just got there's a lot of things coming at us. And so kind of almost, it's like they have access to too much, and there's the demands, I guess, is really exceeds what the attention that we have. And so really getting something that we talk a lot about is the ability to really block that out and engage your frontal lobe, and being strategic in what you're not only what you are going to pay attention to, but then what you're not going to pay attention to. And so I think that speaks to even the examples you were saying of when I'm choosing to spend my time this way, then I'm also recognizing that I have less time for these other things. Um, and so I think that's a huge thing for young people that they're trying to navigate without really a lot of it's not something that you're really taught in school of how to manage that, or really be careful with your attentional resources.
Yeah, I think you're talking about basically, like, I don't know what the right word is, but maybe mindfulness, just like paying attention or being deliberate and thoughtful about your days and your values in life, and what's important to you, and then how this, and trying not to get yourself worked up into an emotional frenzy about all these deadlines and stuff, because we're always going to have more work. Work is never going to leave us. It's going to be there, right? Deadlines are going to be there, and we can try and create a life that we can meet them. But the reality is, especially in this year when things are so challenging for so many people, and there's so many unexpected things that happen, people getting COVID and people being sick, and caregiving responsibilities, we have to really think about what's important to us. And work is one part of life. I love what Freud said about this. It's like, the way a person is mentally healthy, they have both meaningful work and meaningful love. And those two really need to balance out.
I love that. And I also love your focus or your interest on not just burnout in the workplace, but burnout in kind of personal life. And so I was thinking about some of the different types of burnout. This could be for caregivers or, just the emotional burnout, or even like I'm thinking about being a senior in high school and having senioritis and just being burnt out on that. And so I guess those are very different, or even like, this whole COVID fatigue, like, so in all these different senses where it's maybe not necessarily, that the demands exceed your resources, like in the senioritis example, but it's just that you're ready for a change.
Mm-hmm.
And so wanted to see your thoughts kind of on how does mindset play into that in terms of choosing, not that just shifting your perspective can necessarily conquer burnout by any means or prevent it, but what kind of role would that play in helping people, spark kind of novelty rather than just sort of settling into this rote status quo that is really draining. But then there's kind of, with COVID fatigue. And anyway, love any thoughts around that. That was a lot of different things.
Novelty is a good thing right now. I mean, in the sense of like, I don't know about you, but my routines are pretty limited, and I walk in the same neighborhoods and whatever every day, and one of the things that I've been trying to do that is helpful for me, I find it to be like really restorative, is if I just try to like see if I can like try to do like a really deep noticing and see if I can see if there's change. Like, so change exists. There's always going to be something new, and part of burnout might be, as you're suggesting, that it's like we're kind of like going through the same motions over and over again, and we're not noticing the little interesting things that are different this time. I love this quote about from Henry Miller about, if you actually focus and pay attention to a blade of grass, it ends up being the most beautiful thing in the universe. And, I think it's a certain mindset that takes a little bit of practice. But I don't believe that we can just like wish ourselves out of burnout either.
Right.
But I do think we can prevent it. So I think it's probably easier to try to practice a bunch of habits now that'll make it less likely. Once we're burned out, though, we need to take the pressure off people who are burned out. I don't think we need to say like, hey, you just need to do this, and you need to just like, do this more. I mean, that advice is for those of us who aren't burned out and who don't want to be in the future. For people who are burned out, they need to like step back and honor the feeling they're having. That's a real feeling. It's very low energy. It does not feel good. And they need to give themselves a space to recover.
So what does that look like? Because that was my next question, was for someone who's already hit that point. And I think, and just talking to some people in preparation for this talk, and as I was thinking about burnout, really a definition of that for me would be when you just don't care anymore. Like it's like and which drastically affects your output, right? And so when you've hit that point, I think stepping away, a lot of people might, if you have the option to change your environment or take a significant step back. But what if you can't, and you don't have the option to change your job or change your hours or whatever that looks like? What do you do to kind of recover from that while still maintaining what you're doing, if that's necessary?
I think that that's very hard. And that's why I also suggest like humane workplace policies, because a better workplace would be one in which if you're feeling ill, you can actually take some time off, to recover. You can get the help you need. And I think in general, the American workplace doesn't know what to do with mental health problems. This is kind of it's not quite a mental illness, but it is definitely not mental wellness. And, I like the idea of the workplace saying, you know what, you're not feeling good, like take a wellness day. I think that's not very common, as you point out, and only very privileged people get to do that. But I'm going to give some like advice, which is maybe like good enough is good enough. Like maybe it's okay to function like suboptimally. Like it's okay to be like, not great. Like I know that goes against our culture to some extent, and there's also been research showing this increase in perfectionism over time, which I think is definitely not good for burnout. But like maybe letting yourself just not be, like lowering your own standards for yourself might be helpful. Like,
Yeah.
this is a year where it's okay if we're not gonna, if we're just barely making it. I mean, that's actually a triumph this year.
And I think I'm hearing a lot of just even self-compassion in that, of being able to recognize, I'm human and I'm doing the best that I can do. I think that's huge. And I see Jennifer tuned in and I'm excited. I can hear Steve already having a lot of thoughts about the brain healthy workplace, because a lot of things that you're touching on are so applicable. And that is a huge initiative that we are pushing forward, of really wanting to change workplace culture to be brain healthy and to really cultivate that. So
that makes me really happy. I want to know more. Tell me more.
yeah, absolutely. So it looks like, yeah, go ahead, Jennifer.
Dr. Conrath, thank you so much so far. We have so many really good questions. What Julie just said about the brain healthy workplace is one of our initiatives. It is exactly what was on my mind. So hopefully we'll get a chance to get to that, but I do want to ask some of these questions from the audience.
Okay, great.
I think that this one kind of really just jumps very well from what you were just talking about. The question is, do we burn ourselves out with our mindset, or is it our circumstances that burn us out? So, you're talking about like just these expectations.
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's kind of both, but I'm always careful. Like, I don't want to blame individuals like who feel terrible, right? Like, that's not productive. I really believe in like structure and like context. And as you saw in my little like cartoons that I showed everybody, like, I'm aware that, and we're all aware, we're all, embedded within families and communities and workplaces and schools and all these different environments. And, we're paying attention to what we're hearing in those environments. And so, for example, in a year like now with COVID, like, I guess I can think of my own experience. I'm still trying to work. I'm still trying to like be productive. But at the same time, I'm also, feeling like my workplace really expects a similar level of productivity as before, which, that's unfortunately not going to be possible. So it's kind of like the two together would be really helpful, kind of having realistic expectations and really focused on, what you can do and what you can do well, and maybe less. But then also being in a supportive environment, a healthy workplace that encourages that kind of mentality. And the irony of all of this to me when I was writing my book was the fact that guess what, everybody, people are way more productive if they take time off, if they have hobbies, if they sleep. So, I mean, for workplaces, it's actually a good idea. It's good for their workers, and it's good for workplaces.
Awesome. That was one of the questions was, is there research that shows that more leisure time relates to more productivity?
Yeah, but I would think at some point that's not true, right? Like maybe if it's 100% leisure time, then of course. But yes, in general, like, obviously, those times you're sitting at the computer and like you're trying to do your work and you're supposed to do something, and like you just keep reading the same line again, or maybe you're reading whatever. My job is all reading, right? All screens. But you're trying to do it because you want to be productive, but actually what you really need, what your body and your brain is telling you, you actually just need a break. And like those times for myself, I just step outside for a few minutes, I come back, and oftentimes I can focus again. So yes, so leisure works like that. A little dose is good. The research saying, you shouldn't sit on your butt all day. You should basically get up every hour or so. It's not just for your physical health, it's also for your own ability to focus. so anyway, but if you actually think about that, like micro breaks and then bigger breaks too, like evenings, weekends, and also vacations.
I know that's one of the big things we advocate for, are like 3 to 5 minute brain breaks where you're just purposefully disconnecting. And I think you're right. We all do it when we're hitting a wall, but also the power of being proactive about it and building it in so that you don't maybe have to hit that wall, as frequently or as hard. So
actually, speaking of technology, I've heard there's these little like the watches that you can program, or whatever devices you can program. I think that Fitbit maybe, but something like that, where it's in order to get you off your butt, right? But imagine if you use that cue as also a way to realize you probably need a break and it's healthy for your brain and your concentration, just to look at something more fresh. I don't know, but that's like we're trying to like now hack ourselves to figure out how we can optimize, and I actually think that's part of the problem, right? Like it's not about leisure so that we can like be more productive. It's about leisure because leisure is fun and great and feels good and helps us connect with people, right? And like a side effect, yeah, we're probably going to be more productive.
Great. So I know you're very, like, these college students is a big area of interest for you, obviously. So here's a question is, what would your advice be for college freshmen who are experiencing their first year of college, during COVID, with this minimal opportunity to socialize with peers? First semester, is more work than anything else. They don't have a lot of leisure outlet. So how can they best prevent burnout when there is no outlet for them? What advice do you have for universities, higher education, during these times?
My advice is to figure out how we can do structured virtual socializing or any type of safe socially distanced socializing, depending on the comfort levels of people involved. I've seen that actually at Notre Dame. I'm on sabbatical there this year, and they have created this beautiful outdoor space where they have lots of like fire pits and like big tents and just really lovely spaces that people can hang out socially distant, and just a way to realize that we still need those connections. But a lot of schools have been totally remote, and it's really, really hard for people to socialize. I've seen my kids who are doing virtual schools, and they're not allowed to like talk to friends during class, which to me is like shocking. Like they don't have like little groups of breakout rooms or whatever. So I just encourage educators to realize that part of education is like social. It's not just a bunch of facts on a screen. Otherwise, what's the purpose of a professor, right? Or like a classroom? The purpose is that we learn much better when we're together with others. So trying to create actually social learning opportunities, I would recommend that. And I also, for that college student, if that person is a college student, good luck to you. I know it's a hard year. You can do this.
Awesome. I know I have a new high schooler this year, and he has the same things of just a new environment, new option for friends, but it doesn't exist. And so trying to find being creative and trying to find these ways is really, really important. All right. Another question was from Doug. He said, thanks for bringing up the political economy of burnout. So if you would please discuss the politics of the now very popular notion of resilience with burnout.
Resilience.
And is anyone asking
Great.
the elites to be resilient? Like how do we?
Oh, wow. I mean, I think that's a really good question, honestly. Like I'm going to write it down because I need to think more about it. But I think to me, the first immediate thought is that we often expect the people to be resilient who have the less structural supports in place, right? So they have, if you think about that burnout equation, right? Like all these demands and expectations, and like we're like, wow, you're so strong when we see certain people doing well in those contexts. So we call that resilience. Instead of thinking about how do we create a culture of resilience, a society that promotes resilience, like broadly, and helps people to face demands and expectations that are challenging. So I think the politics of that would be about putting resources, giving resources to people to promote resilience, and not assuming that it just is some magical thing we all have. But I want to think about that more because that's like a really interesting insight. And I just want about politics. I also don't want to say like that there's one party or a different party or whatever that promotes burnout. I mean, if you look at the rise of inequality over time, this is not going to be a popular opinion for either side. But the rise of inequality over time has been occurring regardless of who the president is or who's in political power in this country. It's a real thing. It's a thing that's affecting all of us in really pretty bad ways. And the only people who are benefiting are like the richest rich. So I'm not sure like why we think that's cool, but I'm kind of done with that.
Yeah. Okay. What exercises or additions would you recommend introducing into a workplace? It doesn't take a lot of time, but it really does improve the environment and lessens burnout chance.
Well, that's always what we want, is something that doesn't take a lot of time. I think that I would question the premise of that to begin with, but I understand that there are constraints. And I think, there was that slide I had that had some ideas about sort of self-care, right? The different aspects. Well, we can cover those in the workplace, right? So why are we sitting, back in the day before COVID, why were we sitting down and having meetings? You could have gone for a walk and had a meeting, right? Walking meetings are something that could be really relaxing and can help you be more creative and things like that. I think workplaces encouraging socializing, like actually taking a lunch together, which, it doesn't really take that long to eat a lunch, but actually defining a time. At this time, we're all going to like sit down and eat something. I think a lot of us are eating lunch or whatever at their desk before even COVID, before we were all at our computers. And we were just kind of off in our own little worlds, but creating kind of social connections between people can help to make us feel less burned out.
Are there any gender differences that are?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. In my book, in my data, I'm using like national trends, and I'm not able to actually separate by gender. But I would guess this might be a little worse for women, partly because I think there are higher expectations on women in terms of all the different roles that we're trying to juggle at the same time. And particularly during this pandemic, where a lot of women are taking on the majority of caregiving while also working full time. So that's kind of classic burnout recipe right there. So I don't know for sure, but I think that's a really good question.
I have a question about how can we overcome cynicism to be realistically optimistic, especially now, and especially in young people where hope can seem limited?
That's a really good question too. Actually, the Notre Dame sabbatical I'm doing is all about trust. It's all about the question of trust and the decline in our society and like how we can try to rebuild it. I know that Mayor Pete, he's in the program and he wrote a book on the topic of trust that I'm excited to read, trying to ask how we can try to rebuild trust. But I think trust is kind of a two-way street, right? Like you trust a person because they treat you well, but you also have to treat them well. So I would say that one way to potentially rebuild trust is to take a chance on trusting. So just assume the person's going to do good to you, and don't assume they're out there trying to harm you or not meaning you well. And I think a lot of times, like if you start, for example, like you walk down the street and you like smile at somebody, have you ever noticed? We don't do this anymore because we're wearing masks. But have you ever noticed back then that you walk down the street and smile, people just smile back? Kind of random, but it happens. And just this kind of principle of like leading with your own trust and seeing what kinds of responses you get. But I actually think it's a big, big issue. And I think there's been a lot that's happened this year that has like really affected people's trust in all kinds of, in other people and institutions. And I think any politician or leader at this point should be thinking about what they can do to promote trust, regardless of whatever their affiliation is. I think that this is something we can all agree is really important. It's like glue for our society.
How much do you think burnout is tied to the growth of consumerism?
A lot. That person is on to something. So like, Julie especially has been really helpful saying, Sarah, like lots of grass. And kind of, I've been trying to tone it down a little bit. My book has tons more, but one of the ones I didn't include was that during the rise of burnout, there's also been a rise in like materialism. So for example, young people now are more likely to say that the number one thing that's important to them in life is earning a lot of money, becoming very rich. So like I get like, they're not just saying like, oh, I just want to have like a comfortable living. They're saying I want to be very rich. And it's something like now, like I think 82% of young Americans right now are saying that, compared to like in the 40s, like 40% or something, like when surveys started. So that's kind of like, to me, that's a clue. Like burnout it's really about expectations, and one of those expectations is wealth. And if you are willing to live a more simple life, then, you know, you're not going to necessarily be chasing this as much. But still, it's harder to, as you saw from that graph in terms of like the real wages of most workers, you know, overall, it's not like they're rising very fast, right? So it's partly, I think, young people desiring to be really rich is a little bit about the fact that they're realistic and they know that things have changed a lot in the economy.
Nice. How can educators avoid instilling the competitive mindset that seems to push burnout culture further? Like, what are some approaches to retaining the motivation that competition provides while reducing the hyper competitiveness that we seem to push within education?
I think that one thing that's very helpful is focusing our teaching on learning outcomes. So it's not so much about, you know, grades and like your value as a person depends on whether you get an A or whatever, but it's really about, hey, do you understand this? And if not, like, what are some ways that we can support you to learn this? And how can you, you know, show me that you've learned this thing? And focusing more on the person's own intrinsic motivation too. Like, what are they actually interested in uniquely? Um, there's a big airplane in the background. I don't know if you can hear it, but so far a cat hasn't jumped on my lap, so that's a good night. But anyway, I just think that for me, and I think about the way I parent my kids, you know, like it's not just like all about the grades. It's like, okay, well, like, do you understand why you know, like why you got a lower grade on that test? Like, it's forget the number, but do you understand kind of like what you missed in your learning? And, you know, is this something you're not even interested in? Because like, you don't have to be interested in everything. You really don't. Like, it's just, you know, letting kids figure out who they are, what they love, accepting they're not perfect, and encouraging that not only in our homes and as parents, but in classrooms.
Yeah, that goes to, it just reminds me, you said earlier, we parent to our values, or we parent our values. And yeah, you know, there's a shift in, or there has to be a shift, I think, in also expectations too, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got one more question. There's so many good questions, Sarah. And
I
so
wish I could answer them all, but I don't want to, seriously don't want to, I joked about it, but I really don't want to burn everybody out. I really appreciate that on an evening that you are all hanging out, just like chatting and paying attention and asking questions.
well, we really appreciate you being here with us tonight too, because we know you're East Coast time. So thank you. Before we just kind of have two more questions, I guess, and Steve wraps it up, I want to invite everybody. Sarah's going to be talking again tomorrow at our Frontiers lecture, and she's talking about something that's completely different. It's really about giving and what does giving do to gifters, right? I got that right? Okay. So we would love it if you know, for any of you that are interested, go to the website and register for that. Again, it's going to be a virtual talk and it's at 12 noon. She's going to be talking 12 to 1. So we would love to have you join us. We got doubly blessed to have Sarah for two things. Also, I just want to let everybody know, obviously holidays are coming up, but we're going to be back in 2021 with Sips in Science. And in January, we're going to have Dr. Kirk Erickson, he's an expert in exercise. And he's going to be giving a talk on walk like a Greek, think like Aristotle. So that's a provocative thing. We would love for you all to join. Also, you know, I think what Sarah's talking about with mindset, how do we expectation management, being flexible and being able to shift. Many of these things are components of brain health that we are studying and deeply interested in. How do we improve these components of brain health? And so our brain health project is something that is our longitudinal study that is looking at this through indexes and online learnings and coaching. And anybody that's interested in that, we would love for you to enroll and be a part of it. Also, if you have anyone in your house that's 8 to 17, we are looking for heavy recruitment for our youth pilot. And again, There you go. Here's a QR code. But we would love, brain health, you're never too young and you're never too old. And I think burnout, thank you, Sarah. I think having this mindset around what that is and how do we adopt different habits and expectations for ourselves and others, you're never too young to start. So I got to say thank you so much. And I know Steve's got, I think, a few questions and some aha takeaways.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jen. It's interesting. So the world I came from, which was this multi-billion-dollar Danaher suite of companies, if you said the term flexible work schedule, people's hair would be on fire because there was a stigma, much like there's a stigma with just talking about mental health. And our whole concept with the brain healthy workplace is this. There's nothing wrong with working hard. There's nothing wrong with productivity, but you said it, you just need to balance, you need to realize what you do has an impact on your brain and your brain health and your overall well-being. So I will tell, this is my own story. So I took our own teachings and we talk about working on elephants very intentfully without distractions in 45-minute bursts when you really have this cognitive load that you need to bring to bear. I give myself time on the back end to down-regulate and do nothing. It doesn't mean I'm coming into work at 10 and leaving at 3. It means when I leave work, I still feel pretty damn good because I've taken advantage of those little bits of downtime you mentioned, and it's entirely consistent with what we talk about. A little goes a long way. And I worry about the other thing that stood out to me was your graph that talked about the gap between expectations and graduation rates. You know what I saw in that? I saw a doubling of actual graduation rates.
Graduate school, yeah.
I didn't see the gap. I just looked at a different stat, and the stat was there was actually good news in that.
Yeah.
So what we need to do is train ourselves, train the workplace to understand there's a need for downtime, but you're not sacrificing productivity, because our hypothesis, and this is some of our early adopters in a brain healthy workplace, our hypothesis is they're actually going to improve in their important measures, which is the bottom line. And it's okay to want to be profitable, but our premise is you need to work smarter, not harder. It used to be a trite expression, but it's actually very brain healthy to work smarter, not necessarily harder. Get off the dang phone. Don't think a break time means you get on your social media. We've forgotten how to take that 5 minutes of downtime at a time. So I thought everything you hit resonated. I know if there were other CEOs and business leaders on, they're probably going, oh my God, does everyone need a hammock at the office? No, that's not what we're saying, right? And we're going to bring some reality to bear on this very, very important concept, because it's not that we should all take work lightly. You just need to approach it differently. And I think in the end, both the workers and the workplace will benefit. So that's our premise.
What you're saying about that is about meaning. It's about finding meaning in our work and also in our life outside of work.
And so important. Dr. Chapman preaches that all the time. She encourages anyone who's here, make sure you're doing what makes you happy. She always calls, does this make your heart sing? If it doesn't, let's find something else for you to do here or help you find something else, because you really should find a place to make your heart sing, both at work and at home. What a great place to be. What a great place to be. Sarah, thank you so much. Jen, thank you so much. Julie, thank you for introducing us to Sarah. It's awesome. And really continue. We appreciate everyone who attended. It is late in the day. Your participation helps. And remember, you're our mouthpiece. When you go out, if you can share some of this with your friends and colleagues, please, we lose if we all just go away kind of patting ourselves on the back. Let's spread the word. Let's be a brain health and kindness advocate and great workplace advocate in your own way, because we can all make an individual difference. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone.